Good afternoon, everyone. So glad you joined us today. My name is Crystal. I'm the education manager at Tomaquag Museum. And I'd just like to say this free educational series is made possible through the generous support of the Rhode Island State Council on the Arts, the United Way, the Island Foundation, and community donors like you. We are so deeply grateful for your continued support, which allows us to share this educational programming freely with audiences near and far. So each month, we've had the privilege of learning from voices that illuminate the enduring significance of Indigenous history, lived experience, and the resilience of Native peoples across centuries of challenge and change. This year's series has been more than educational. Each presenter has informed and enlightened us on a range of topics within their areas of expertise. And today's session is the final in our series. And I look forward to closing out the year with two individuals who have come together to share with us. Before we begin, a quick reminder, please place yourself on mute. You're welcome to share any of your questions or comments in the chat, and we'll do our best to address them at the end of today's presentation. And now I'd like to introduce our presenters today. It's my pleasure to introduce Robert Geake, who's a public historian and the author of 15 books on Rhode Island and New England history, including From Slaves to Soldiers, which is our topic today, the First Rhode Island Regiment in the American Revolution, co-authored with Lorén Spears. Mr. Geake served 2 terms as the president of Cocomscusick Association, which maintains Smith's Castle, a historic house museum in North Kingstown, Rhode Island, and he continues as chair of the association's education committee. He also serves on the advisory board of the Rhode Island Slave History Medallion Project and helped organize the effort to place a medallion on the grounds of Smith's Castle. Most recently, he has been working with the Battle of Rhode Island Association and other sponsors to produce a series of seminars on the underwritten of the American Revolution over the next several years of the war's anniversary. Lorén Spears uh, is an enrolled Narragansett Tribal Nation citizen and executive director of Tomaquag Museum. She holds a master's in education and received a Doctor of Humane Letters honoris causa from the University of Rhode Island in 2017 and a Doctor of Education honoris causa from Roger Williams University in 2021. She is an author, artist, and culture bearer who shares her knowledge with the public through museum programs. She's contributed to a variety of publications, including Dawnland Voices, an anthology of Indigenous writing of New England, Through Our Eyes, an Indigenous view of Mashapaug Pond, and today's subject of conversation. Under her leadership, the Tomaquag Museum received the Institute of Museum and Library Service National Medal in 2016, and she has been the recipient of numerous awards and honors, including induction into the Rhode Island Heritage Hall of Fame. Just going to admit a few more. Now, please welcome me in joining Lorén Spears and Robert Geake.
Hello, everyone. Kwasin. I hope you're enjoying this beautiful fall day. I'm looking forward to presenting today with my friend and colleague, Robert Geake. I'm going to be needing to share our screen, so I'm going to ask our tech team to help us put the share button on so that I can share our screen. As we share about the First Rhode Island Regiment in the American Revolution today, but also how that's also connected to other I don't know what's happening here.
All right, hold on. I'm going to mute and see if I can do this correctly. I'm just going to hit
Y-
you, Lorén, and allow you to share. I think that's
Yes,
what I
please.
didn't do correctly.
And so we'll share about this regiment and its impact in the Revolutionary War, and then also, um, as appropriate, expand around some of the other areas in which Indigenous people served in the Revolutionary War. And hopefully we can share our screen momentarily. Here
I
we
just
go.
made you host so that you can.
Thank you. There we go. Um, there is a button so that you can share, allow me to share the screen without me being the host, because otherwise then I have to keep letting people in too. So
Oh,
we'll see.
sorry. All right, you
We'll
can
see.
change me back to host and I'll keep letting people in.
Looks like
If
we're on our way. Okay.
if you yeah, there we go. So this is a an image that was painted commemorating the First Rhode Island Regiment called Brave Men as Ever Fought. And it's this image is from the Museum of the American Revolution. And I just think it's a really great way to start thinking about um, the inclusion of Indigenous people and also African descended people in the American Revolution. And so this is an opportunity for us to think about that. But I wanted Bob to share a little bit about the painting and the sort of where it is and the context of it, please.
Well, this is a painting by Don Troiani, a noted historical painter, and it depicts the Rhode Island Regiment, actually, as it was called then, on its march to Yorktown in 1781. Now, when you talk about public history and historical accuracy, in public history, this is the image of the First Rhode Island Regiment with that resplendent uniform and those hats with the anchor on them. Very impressive. They certainly must have made a great impression when they marched into Philadelphia that day. But it was not the uniform that they had for much of the war. These were issued in December 1780, and before then, their hunting frock was the noted element of their uniform, but their hats may have been tricorn or they may have been just wool slouch hats. They may have had leggings, they may not have. It was really a combination of whatever uniform they could put together. And so when they did get these uniforms, they were most impressive, and especially when they became sort of the military police later on in Philadelphia. They were well renowned and well respected for their behavior and both for the uniforms that they wore that day.
Oh, there we go. I couldn't get my thing to go forward, so I apologize for that moment. So we wanted to just kind of give you some broad strokes, and then we're going to dig into some stories as we go. But we wanted to think about who served. When you think about the time period in which this is going on, and Indigenous people are about 150 years after King Philip's War, it kind of gives you an idea of like wondering why would they serve? Why would they participate in this? And we talk about this in a lot of different ways that they might serve because in Native communities, we often had warrior societies, and there was a lot of respect for the warriors and because they're the people that promote peace and are negotiating and also ensuring the safety and well-being of the community. But we also talked about that they're also trying to throw off the yoke of tyranny from Great Britain and how that might be also a reason, because maybe they think if they break free from Great Britain, they would also have freedoms in this new land that would become. There's so many other areas and things that they were thinking about. Maybe they were also thinking about, ooh, I was trying to let somebody in. They were trying to think about their own homelands and protecting that space. But there's also opportunities here because of 150 years after what is known today as King Philip's War, what we decolonize and call the War for New England. is a chance for employment and education and maybe a pension, maybe adventure. You know, people go into military service for those reasons even today, but most importantly for liberty. And so those were some of the things that we were thinking about in why. Oh, I jumped ahead to why people served instead of who people served. But sorry about that. Um, I need to get the thing off of there for me keep doing because it's distracting me. But nonetheless, go ahead, Bob. You can also talk about who served and maybe why we'll go back to why as well.
Let me just preface the act that happened in 1778 by saying that indigenous people were serving from the beginning of the war. Rhode Island had two regiments, and there were indigenous people that were serving, including a man named Charles Daniels and Harry Matthews in the second Rhode Island, before the first Rhode Island that we know of as the Black Regiment, as it came to be known, was put into place. And so uh, prior to 1778, Connecticut and Massachusetts had considered allowing black slaves to enlist in the Continental lines, but they had difficulty navigating between how that would happen. Would the owners of the enslaved people be paid? Would they not? Would the enslaved people be allowed to serve with the Continental Line, or would they have their own regiment, as Rhode Island later did? And so the when Varnum and the Rhode Island regiments were at Valley Forge in December of 1777, it was really the lowest point for the Continental Army. They were seeing a lot of deserters at that time. There were men whose terms were about to expire, and they were going to lose a great deal of their army once again. Many men enlisted for 1 year. So at the end of the year, December was a harrowing time for Washington and others who were trying to keep the army together. So at Valley Forge just came about that Colonel Green and Lieutenant Flagg, who had served at Fort Mercer with a number of black and indigenous soldiers, came to Varnum with the proposal that they raise a regiment of enslaved people here in Rhode Island. Rhode Island at the time had the largest amount of slaves per capita as any of the colonies. And so this was a prospect which Varnum thought was very hopeful. And it was really to boost the army and the number of men in the army, rather than, as you know, some people like to say, well, it was an effort to change the course of history in the sense of giving blacks and indigenous people the opportunity to serve in the military. Well, blacks and indigenous people had been serving in the military prior in the Indian Wars and so forth. And so when this act came about, it was really an act that was based upon the reality that the Army needed more men. And so Varnum put together a letter to Washington with this proposal. Washington approved it, sent it along to Governor Nicholas Cook in Rhode Island, who supported it and put it before the General Assembly. And so in February 1778, in East Greenwich, where the General Assembly was meeting at the time, this act was put forward and approved to allow, as it says there, allowing any Negro, mulatto, or Indian slave to enlist and to earn their freedom and be as if they were absolutely free once they enlisted, as it was termed in the act. And so initially, I had determined about 140. Some have about 125. Another historian, John Dower, a friend of mine, has determined 125 former enslaved people enlisted, but it was short of a battalion. So what they did to form as full a battalion as they could was to take the indigenous people and the black soldiers from the Second Rhode Island Regiment and put them into this newly formed First Rhode Island Regiment. And so by the time that they were training and thus leading up to the Battle of Rhode Island, which the regiment is mostly known for, even though they served long beyond that, um, they were about, let me see, I think 181 privates enlisted by the time of the Battle of Rhode Island in August 1778. So as well, the actual battalion, what became known as the Black Regiment, was actually an amalgamation of those enslaved people who enlisted, as well as indigenous people, and even a handful of people of European descent who had been servants or had been engaged in commerce or labor at some point and enlisted.
So even though I jumped ahead and got into why they served a little bit there, I wanted to say the word anua now, which means service to the community, like military service. And I think it's really important for our communities to think about Indigenous service. This happens to be an image that was used on the book that's representing like a drawing that represents from history this particular regiment. And as Bob was saying, that the second regiment is connected to this first regiment, and then there was also the sixth regiment that is connected as well. And then of course there were indigenous people fighting in other regiments up and down the 13 colonies, which is really important for us to think about. Um, I also wanted to talk about like a little bit what's going on around this time, thinking about that time after the war for New England and the indigenous people having this diaspora to Brothertown. Brothertown today, we think of that as Brothertown, Wisconsin, but the diaspora actually went north to Brothertown, New York, and then westward to various locations north and south in the West. There were like dozens of locations, but the one that has still remained is Brothertown, Wisconsin. And it was this push of indigenous people finding ways to survive in this changing world and find new ways to thrive in this. And so there's a lot of displacement that's happening, and indigenous people are being displaced from their land. They're being forced into assimilative practices through school, through religion, through work and forced labor as well. And are working toward their survival and wanting their freedom and the honor of that freedom. So for some that were enslaved, this was a mechanism to get that freedom, but also the opportunity to care for and protect their own families and communities while doing so. Bob, maybe you have some additional thoughts here as well.
Well, I think from all these points that you've talked about, because of this upheaval, really among the Narragansett people, I think that's one reason why there are so few pension applications from Narragansetts who served. You know,
Yes, and we're going to dive into those pensions in a
uh,
bit, right?
yes, yes, absolutely.
So there was one particular story that always struck me as interesting. It's about Simeon Simons. So he let me start with that Indigenous Rhode Island soldiers contributed to the Revolutionary War were remembered well into the 20th century in general. They were remembered through oral history, occasionally in print. In 1935, in the Narragansett Dawn, there's a remembrance from Mrs. Lucy Miles, whose family includes male members. This is a quote that's in there, who served as soldiers in the colored regiment in the Revolutionary War. These memories are documented in different times. There's memories of our ancestors and their service documented in the Narragansett Dawn, in the DAR, in state records, in speeches of people like Princess Redwing. In a particular speech, she told the story of Simeon Simons, a Narragansett who attended Dartmouth College in 1777 received the first degree in 1777. And one of the things that I like, it reminds people all these elite institutions like Dartmouth, like Harvard, they were originally native schools. They were formulated in many cases to educate indigenous people and have transformed over time. But he joined the Continental troops and fought for liberty from tyranny. And in speaking to the Woonsocket DAR, Princess Redwing, she says, Having an education, he fought side by side with your ancestors and for the same cause. Although your gain meant in reality his loss, as far as land and material things went. Later, she elaborated to the reporter from the Woonsocket Call the story that Simons and others had gathered on the village green in Patchogue, Connecticut. And for those of you that don't know where that is, that's just a little stone's throw away from where Tomaquag Museum is over in Connecticut, um, to greet General Washington. Washington had been struck, this is what's written and what she has said in these speeches, by the clear blue eyes of the indigenous boy and chose him on the spot to accompany him. Simons became a life's guardsman for the general through the duration of the war. Now, mind you, he wasn't a boy, uh, since he was already with the degree and already serving in troops. But when you think about it, a lot of these troops were very young. And so that is really interesting to think about. Um,
It
Anything
was a
else you'd
young
like to
man's
add?
war. It was a young man's war. The average age was 18 to 21, and some as young as 14 and 15 enlisted as well. But Simeon Simons was not the only Narragansett or indigenous person, especially in southern New England. We find that a number of indigenous soldiers served in both Connecticut and Rhode Island, Massachusetts sometimes. So their activity and their service was very fluid through different reasons. This was important. Speaking of pensions, this was important when it came time to apply for a pension or hope for a pension because you had to bring evidence of all of that service before the board, and that was difficult sometimes if you were serving in different communities in different states, even, you know. So I think that was one problem that, well, we'll talk about those pensions a little bit, but yeah, there was Simon certainly was one of those who served in both Connecticut and, as you say, uh, it's just a stone's throw from Tomaquag, and even some. I found a case of one person from Voluntown. He enlisted in Voluntown for the First Rhode Island Regiment, and then later served in Connecticut. So
Yeah, so there's many stories to tell about these brave men that served. There's other no cake family men on the muster rolls, including John and James and Gideon. Um, Nearly 100 years later, facing the committee that would eventually detribalize his people, Gideon's grandson spoke proudly of his legacy, stating, "My grandfather, in his time, stood second in the council for years and years. He was a member, went to the Revolutionary War, and came back and lived and died at home." And these are the kinds of remembrances that we have, this pride of service that our ancestors had. There was Daniel Perry in December 25th, 1783, discharged. He too signed the petition and later married a free black woman named Ruth of South Kingstown, and then was registered as black after that. So that kind of speaks to the erasure in our communities that you can go into the war as an indigenous person. If you marry someone that they deemed as a black woman, that made you a black man now. So that was very interesting on the kind of paper genocide that was taking place and this erasure of indigenous identity through the documentation of birth, death, marriage, service in the war. Um, with his choice to carry a free black woman and have children, Perry would lose his official identity as a Narragansett man. Words of one Narragansett historian, who we talk about often, is called that the beginning of paper genocide, and that's Tall Oak that talked about that quite a bit. This was very widespread, this type of erasure. Some of it was just based on observational looks on whether someone was deemed black or colored rather than indigenous. And we could spend a lot of time talking about that, but it's talking about these terms that are used in public records as a way to assimilate and eradicate indigenous people. So we're going to talk a bit about the after the war, how people returned home. In some cases, they just returned to their village and kind of got erased from the Eurocentric American narrative because they were in their home communities doing their things. We talk about how few of them got pensions, and Bob is going to talk in a moment a little bit more about pensions and how they got those pensions. We're going to like think about the land loss that continues to happen here and the way that they're using that land loss, that identity loss to continue to take land from Indigenous people. Um, this is a quote that's in the book that we did that through Narragansett within households, the importance of losing such status in the government record would be realized with the state's advances to detribalize the remaining Narragansett beginning in 1846 and based on the part of their quote unquote dwindling numbers. But the numbers were dwindling because they were writing us out of existence as this strategy of erasure. And by 1879, the General Assembly formally met to inquire in the justice, expediency, and practicability of abolishing the tribal relations of the Narragansett Indians. Um, so these forms of erasure were part of what led to detribalization and also the labeling of people as other based on who they may or may not have married. And in some of these cases, they change the identity of one person, and then when the next person marries them, then they change that person's identity. So they both could have been Narragansett to begin with, and then eventually they're told that they're something else. And so those are all those kinds of things. Um, After the war, I wanted to mention Henry Matthews because I think that's pretty cool to mention that he earned a badge of distinction at 16 years old. And I think these are the kinds of things that often are not spoken about. And the fact that Indigenous people have the highest number per capita of service in the U.S. Armed Forces from the Revolutionary War through today. And the key words is per capita. Um, some of those acronyms I have on the bottom are just things that come even later, the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, the Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978, the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978, and federal recognition in 1983. I kind of bring those up because you see from the Revolutionary War, there's this real attack on erasure of Indigenous people and the taking away of land and life and liberty and um, ideology, identity. And so these are laws, federal laws, that are doing the reversal of those things as we move forward. But I do want to give Bob a chance to dig deep into what's happening after the war as far as the pensions. As I mentioned, there's very few people that get them. And so it's really interesting to hear about those that do. So he's going to give you a little glimpse of the pensions of some of these Indigenous veterans.
So when Indigenous veterans had the opportunity to submit a pension application, it was a very arduous process. First of all, they had to find evidence from fellow soldiers, if they could, from their former commanders, that they had actually served. And then each of those people who were giving testimony, be they friends, fellow soldiers, and so forth, uh, had to do so in a public manner before a probate court or before a judge or before an attorney. That attorney would then write at the bottom of their statement that they were judged to be a person of good character and so forth and so on. So there were a lot of hurdles to go through with pensions. And I think it's fair to say that pensions from Indigenous soldiers, black soldiers, people of color, were much more heavily scrutinized and much looked at with greater skepticism than soldiers who were white that applied for pensions after the war. And I'm going to give you a couple of cases of that. One pension application was made by John Harry. I think we mentioned before, he had served under 3 years under Colonel Christopher Green and later under Colonel Jeremiah Olney of the Rhode Island Regiment. He's also listed as serving in the last year of the war in Captain Allen's detachment. And surviving regimental records indicate that he had enlisted in December 1780 for a term of 3 years. He was then 18 years old. And he listed his occupation as a laborer, and he was from Charlestown, Rhode Island. Now, John Harry and his wife Mary later applied for a pension for his service, um, as any soldier who had served for at least 6 months with the army was allowed to do. His application was supported by testimony from his former employer named Levi Totten, who wrote that he had been in a debilitative state after the war and unable to perform a man's day's work, in his words. And he had employed him for sundry times over 3 years, and he had reputedly shown this man a wound in his side and that part of his ribs were missing. And this gentleman, Totten, understood that this was a wound he had received whilst he was serving in the Revolutionary Army. But these pensions were always investigated by government officials, and when they were investigated, the couple found that they were actually getting some income of $20 per year from 42 acres that they owned. In order to clarify the issue, the tribal council submitted a copy of the agreement. In addition, Augustus Harry penned an eloquent and very frank letter to the commission, to the War Commission. He wrote that I have personally known John Harry of Charlestown, who was one of our tribe, as long as I remember anybody. I never knew him to own any land or real estate of any kind. And he goes to clarify the tribal tradition of the land. The Narragansett tribe, he writes, and the individuals thereof hold their land in a tenure peculiar to themselves, not as white people hold lands. An individual of said tribe cannot sell or convey any land descended to him or her, nor mortgage it or charge it with debts as white people do. But when a member of that tribe dies, his or her land descends to his or her children or next of kin, generally without distinction of male or female. So he further testified that John Henry was very poor, and he wrote, I believe him destitute of property, quite infirm, and unable to do hard labor. He sometimes performed some light work for which he received some compensation, but at present he was principally supported by his children who labored to support him. And he writes, if he was not helped by his children, he would in some measure be chargeable to the tribe. So what the tribe did was to give the couple income was to give them these 42 acres of tribal land that they could then rent out to have some income over the time that they lived there. So this was not land that they owned, this was tribal land. And this was their way of helping this elderly couple to support themselves. You can go to the next slide. And this is Harry's letter, rather. He is not related to John Harry, but he was a tribal council member for many years. And he wrote in the meantime um, that the government's misunderstanding was that John Harry was the master of his house. The land was actually supported by his wife, who was the matriarchal of the family. And so he eventually did receive a pension of $8 per month. And that was issued to him on November 8th, 1820. But this was a unique letter that I found in my research, and it clearly states to the government the Narragansett way of dealing with the elderly that are in their care, with land and keeping that land and keeping it within the tribe and its use for the tribe, which I found very, very unique and certainly enlightening. So the other case that I want to talk about is of John George. Now, John George was one of the earliest who had enlisted in the army, and he was one of those indigenous people that enlisted numerous times, 3 times over the course of the war. This was a very common thing, both for white soldiers and for people, patriots of color, to serve a little bit at a time, 1 year at a time, maybe possibly 3 years. And as the war went on for 8 years, they had opportunities to serve another year and then another year after that. And this is basically what George had done. Um, so he had applied for a pension. John George applied for a pension in 1818, and he was approved also for a pension of $8 a month. But he died 2 years later, leaving his widow, Bridget, without any kind of compensation. So she then applied for assistance from the War Department, and this was then went 17 years after her application. She had to fight to have this application approved. And so when she was 79, by the time that she was 79, when she received this, she could neither read nor write, and she was had difficulty giving testimonies at the hearings. So I'll give you a little bit of this deposition that she gave. She had received assistance from Israel Chapin, the Justice of the Common Court of Pleas, in submitting her deposition in 1837. And it makes for a very interesting reading. So she writes that when Colonel Green was killed, the St. John George, that is, was captured with the others at Croton River. Now that was the lowest point and the most dangerous point for the what was then the Rhode Island Regiment, composed largely of members of the First Rhode Island. And so in that attack at Croton River on May 14th, 1781, when they were along in upstate New York, along the Croton River in what was called the Rhode Island encampment, they were attacked by a loyalist force at dawn, and 11 were killed and 20 more were captured. And John George was one of those indigenous people, the indigenous soldiers who was captured at that attack. And so he was later released, and she could not recall at the time of her deposition how long he was actually kept prisoner, but he later served under Colonel Olney, which means that this was, of course, after Green. Green was killed at that attack as well. Green and Lieutenant Ebenezer Flagg were both murdered during that attack in 1781. So Bridget recalled that they were married by Peleg Cross, a justice of the peace, although she had no certificate of marriage. And again, this was important. If you were going to apply for assistance, you had to prove that you were actually the wife of the person that had served. And so attempts to find a marriage certificate turned up empty. But Bridget then turned to her neighbors, the neighboring women of the Narragansett tribe, who came forward and supplied ample testimony to show that she was the wife of John George. Susan Henry, for instance, wrote that she was well acquainted with the couple and had attended their wedding at the house of Moses Skeesuck, the brother of Bridget, and also a former indigenous soldier in the Revolution from Rhode Island. A woman named Elizabeth Primus also provided written testimony affirming the same, that she also was at the wedding and that she knew the couple very well for many years. So ultimately, though, the greatest evidence on her behalf was written by Colonel Jeremiah Olney after the war, when he wrote on behalf of John George, having served in the army and having mentioned his wife Bridget and written to her having someone written to her several times. So ultimately, Bridget George received a payment of $560 in 1838, but by that time she was 80 years of age. And as I look at these pensions time and time again, I see through the hurdles that these Narragansett women especially had to go through to help their husbands either achieve a pension or to get assistance from the government themselves after their husbands had died. And these are some of the evidence that the records that were provided for her support during that time.
Those are so amazing. Thank you, Bob. I love hearing the drill down of all these stories because when we learn about the difficulty for the men to garner a pension, and then you realize that in some cases it's the women that also have to fight for the pension for the care of their families if something happens to the husband. So that was very, very, very interesting to hear.
Yeah, daughters as well often were the ones who were making pension applications. Um, Very often, both patriots of color that returned to their communities after the war were often still illiterate and could not write their own pension testimonies, so they had to hire someone or have someone do it for them. And often these were the wives of the men enlisted those people to do that, and they enlisted the support of others to help. And of course, again, as widows, they had to support themselves in the effort to get pensions and applications and some assistance.
So, as we are thinking about these men who served, we're thinking about, just doing this kind of a talk is part of that is remembrances. It's remembrances through that honor the people that served, especially those that are often erased out of that service. So there's the books that are written. I have two here. I know there's more, but I spotlighted our own book. And then the children's book, The Black Regiment. I did that sort of purposefully because I often think in the contemporary times, the terminology that is being used often erases Indigenous people from these regiments. And I know the numbers sort of move around on how many actual Native people served in each of these regiments and how many served in the Revolutionary War because that is fluid. But I think the thing that strikes me is that in the 20th and 21st century, there's just like a whole erasure of Indigenous participation in the Revolutionary War. And so this book that Bob started and did all the major research on, um, it was a great opportunity for us to work together to uncover some of the stories that are so hard to find in the record around Indigenous service in the Revolutionary War. In this image, this is a group of reenactors. Bob might remember the actual reenactment group's name because I can't recall it right now. But so there's people that are reenacting the
These are
participation of Indigenous and African descended peoples in the regiment.
these are from these are reenactors from Trenton, New Jersey, and I believe they're posing with Charles Roberts of Risham.
Yes.
Um, so they arrived. They came to Newport a couple of years ago to be part of the Juneteenth celebration. But I just as far as indigenous people serving in the war, people have to remember that beyond the first Rhode Island Regiment, what became known as the Black Regiment historically, there were hundreds of indigenous people that served in militia, served part-time, served in 9-month levies in the Continental Line. That happened all throughout the war, all throughout the 8 years of the war, and so for even for the numbers that served in the Rhode Island Regiment, far beyond that, there were many, many more that served in other ways. And, beyond the life of a soldier, wagoners, cooks, all manner of laborers that the Army needed to clear roads and so forth. All of that was open to indigenous people, and many, many served in that capacity as well.
And just as a little shout out to our friends at PBS, there's also the Ken Burns, The American Revolution, that is going on right now. If you haven't started watching it, your streaming service, I'm sure, has it. Or you can download the PBS app, as I did to be able to watch it. But what I would say is he's taken a lot of effort to include some of those indigenous narratives into the work that he was doing on telling the story of the American Revolution and to tell some of those untold stories of what took place. And so everything that we do is about honoring Indigenous veterans. So thinking about this presentation is really about another way in which we can honor the service of Indigenous people that served in the Revolutionary War, of which we have no pictures. So I thought I would put some people that were in the different armed forces at different time periods, but to give a little idea that we still per capita have the highest number of service in U.S. Armed Forces and have served in every branch of the armed forces. And as we go forth to the semi-quincentennial and thinking about that, I show a Narragansett woman who is very high up in the Army, but showing her in traditional clothes that is reflective of Indigenous identity, but also the honor and respect of service in the U.S. Armed Forces. And then lastly, just to think about if you haven't been over to the Rhode Island Veterans Cemetery in a while, a couple of years ago, we put in a monument to honor all veterans that served in the U.S. Armed Forces. At the Rhode Island Veterans Cemetery, it does speak to tribal nations and people that are reflected in that particular cemetery, but the monument itself is for all veterans over all time to honor and respect Indigenous veterans. And those cutting the ribbon were veterans that were serving in the time period, I think, from the Korean War onward, if my memory serves. So a lot of service in the U.S. Armed Forces for Indigenous people still today, and this is a small sampling of those that were there for that ribbon cutting.
First question is, do we know if any of their wives or any other Indigenous women also served?
Well, I can say that they served in respect to going along with them to encampments very often, cooking for them, doing laundry for them, being a wife while they were there in the service. That happened both for many many soldiers. Valley Forge in 1777, when the entirety of the army came together and all of the wives and all of the people who were supporting the army, it was the third largest city in America. So think about that for a moment. It's incredible to think about, but that's how many women and support groups, people came forward with the army. So we don't know of any in the Rhode Island Regiment who served. There are those stories out there of women who took up the gun and so forth and served in Molly Pitcher and others, of course. But I don't know of any specifically in the Rhode Island Regiment or in Rhode Island forces.
Uh, what language is a noun owl? I'm not sure how to say it actually, Ren, but
So that's Narragansett. This is the
okay.
only Indigenous language I know well enough to come up with any words. So
Can you
yeah.
say that word correctly?
Sure. It's a now.
New one now. Sorry, folks.
Means service, like military
What?
service.
Okay. Next question. What is Narragansett Dawn?
Oh, good question. So it's a news periodical that was written in the 1930s and early 1940s. Princess Redwing was one of the editors. There were a group of people that were working to put it together, and there were a lot of writers that were writing in it. And it was documenting what was going on during the time of the Indian Reorganization Act in 1934. And it was taking oral history, what was going on at that moment in time of what was happening in the Narragansett community, thinking about the fact that we were illegally detribalized in 1880 to 1882. And then this federal law comes into play in 1934 about tribal nations reorganizing. And so we were part of that process. The symbol that you see today that represents the Narragansett Indian tribe is the symbol that Red Wing actually drew in 1930s to represent that incorporation and reorganization of our tribe, but it was also the continued work of many, many people from the moment of detribalization on. Our communities were fighting, the leaders of the day were fighting all the whole time. They never acquiesced, they never relinquished their right and authority to sovereignty. And so Narragansett Dawn was a piece of that sovereignty of voice and expressing what was going on in not only our own community, but where our community was traveling. There's articles in there where people are going up to North Dakota and other tribal communities, helping them fight for their sovereignty. So people are in indigenous communities were moving around and supporting each other in this fight for justice, for indigenous rights and sovereignty. And that was a news periodical, one of the very first in the eastern coast of the United States, written by Native community.
This is more of a comment than a question, but in case you want to respond to it, I have read that capitalism had an investment in the erasure or narrowing recognition of indigenous folks who had sovereignty and in the expansion of blackness for those who were enslaved. Thus, blood quantum and the one drop rule enshrining opposite definitions of racial categories in law.
Yeah, so the short answer, that's something I could spend like 3, 5, 10 hours talking about. There is what was the name of that podcast? All My Relations. If you look up the All My Relations podcast, they spent 2 episodes, 2 full hour-long episodes talking about blood quantum. It's a construct of the federal government. They made that up. And the purpose of making it up is totally about conquest and the land and its resources. If there are no native people that they have to be beholden to based on treaties and laws and agreements of various sorts, then they can take the land and use those land and resources for what they want. And so it is definitely integral in the strategy for conquest. But there's not enough time here to talk about it fully, but that's my very short answer for that.
I'll just add to that 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 was certainly the intention behind the detribalization of the tribe, and as Tall Oak wrote, the paper Genocide was to reduce the numbers, reduce the numbers, reduce the numbers until they could say there's nothing really left of the tribe and we should just take over that land, you know. And so, yeah, as Lorén, there's a great discussion that could be had about that, but it's
And it's also why we gained federal recognition in 1983 because it was proven that it was an illegal action. And there was documentation, not only the Narragansett Dawn, but what was going on at the Indian Church, what was going on in the tribal government that was still ongoing, even when the federal government said we didn't exist, and what was going on in the community that was documenting all of these things. And so the Narragansett Dawn was just one thing, one place where there was a lot of documentation of what was happening in the community at that time that was proving that we were still getting together on a government level, and sustaining our community as a nation. And so it was what helped us get to federal recognition,
So,
an acknowledgement, as we call it.
sorry, are there records or stories of local Indigenous Nation members serving with the British or Loyalist units?
I have not found any, but certainly, you know, indigenous soldiers outside of New England served certainly with the British.
Yeah.
That's pointed out in Ken Burns' story. But I do not know of any Rhode Islanders or Narragansett or any indigenous people in New England who sided with the British.
Yeah, it was more in other spots of the colonies where indigenous people served with the British, not necessarily in this chunk, this area of the colonies. I agree with Bob on that. It wasn't really, it's the there were different places where people were taking up on both sides, like same communities with both sides having people, but it was more south of here in the southern colonies, from my
Yeah.
understanding, like in Virginia and West Virginia and places. Sure, I don't
Another
know.
question. Did Narragansett Indians who became described as black due to their marriage to a black woman have their status or regard impacted negatively by the Narragansett community?
That's a tough one to answer. I don't know, like it's hard to go back in time and know that. Um, so it's complicated. So if you haven't gone to see the exhibit Entwined over at Mystic Seaport Museum, Akia de Barros Gomes was the curator. I and many other Indigenous and African descended peoples have served on the advisory for that, but we speak to in that exhibit how there were some commonalities between indigeneity here and indigeneity there, and why that when people were being subjugated in various ways, why they might work together and create community. And also understanding what nationhood means and how you get to decide who's in your nation and who's not. So these are external forces, in my opinion, on what is making something negative or not negative, as opposed to the Native community itself making it negative or not negative. It's the external ideals that if you had one drop of African blood, if you will, in you, you were no longer indigenous. That was what we were fighting against as opposed to the people, right? And if you had one drop of white blood in you, you were still just Indian. Like, it's like this thing. And it was really this, it's just a strategy of conquest. It was a strategy of erasure and a strategy for being able to take the land and the resources and to subjugate the people and create a new labor force that was subjugated to do the jobs that nobody else wanted.
I live on an 18th century farm and am working on its history. Mercy Baker, who was enslaved here, married Prince Angel, who served in the first, but died in Philly. He's mentioned in your book. I
Mhm.
also suspect that one of the enslaved here was Narragansett or Caribbean indigenous, another identity often erased. Interested in the wives following idea as Mercy disappears from records around the time Prince served.
Mm. That's very interesting. I'd be glad to look into that and see if I can find more about that. I do recall Prince, but I have not. That's not one person that I've looked into beyond that. But there are others. I know that, as I mentioned, John Dower is working on a book with biographies of each individual person in the regiment. Christian McBurney is working on a book about the regiment. So I'm very proud that Lorén and I have started this, interest in have rekindled the interest in the Black Regiment, the First Rhode Island Regiment, and again, it's only going to show more and more, I think, of how the indigenous contribution as we go into those histories.
So we're almost at the end of our time. I'm just going to give one last question and then close. What other tribes besides the Narragansett served with the Rhode Island regiments? And we have about 1 minute left before time.
Well, there's certainly Niantic and certainly Wampanoag who served in the Rhode Island Regiment or in Rhode Island, sometimes on privateers as well. Providence was a big port for having privateers. The sloop Providence, one of the Perry boys and John Nocake served on the sloop Providence that gained 7 prizes during the course of their service in the war. So again, many contributions in various ways during the war beyond the foot soldier.
Thank you. So I just want to say thank you everyone for joining today. Thank you, Robert and Loren, for this very informative
Thank you for having.
presentation today. So happy to have you. So today's session has been recorded and will be available on Tomaquag's YouTube page in the coming weeks. So feel free to revisit it and let others know as well. And while this concludes our series for this year, visit our website for updates on next year's series and other upcoming programs. Stay connected and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. We ask that, well, excuse me, have a lovely afternoon, a blessed holiday season, and we hope to see you all again.
And join us at Nakomo on December 6th at the Quanakantog Grange, noon to 4. You can get that info on our website too.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everyone. Have a lovely day and Winnie Tabutan Tamawonk. Happy Thanksgiving.